What's up, you guys? Tyler Huxford here, and for today's video we're going to be talking about how to start your own Pico tank. So let's jump right into this. So Pico tanks are generally defined as any tank that is 5 gallons or less. And though the assumption might be that with less water comes less work, this is absolutely not the case. In fact, it is quite the opposite. With less water comes more importance on things like water parameters, water changes, and especially husbandry. But if a 5-gallon tank is your dream, you've come to the right place.
So to kick things off, let's go over what you need. Never mind that fool dancing in the background, he's just excited to get going. But first thing you're going to need is a tank with some space to put things in the back. Secondly, you're going to need some live rock. You'll notice that I'm placing the live rock in as a first step. The reason I'm doing that is because a lot of the critters that do well in Pico tanks are burrowers. If you put the rock in first, you don't have to worry about the rock tumbling on your critters later. Secondly, what you'll need is some live sand. So I recommend this sand. This is the pink Fiji sand. Looks really good, and critters seem to really like it. Make sure, once again, you use a lot of sand here, plenty for burrowers to be happy. Thirdly, what you'll need is a pump. You'll absolutely want some flow in your tank. You may even need 2 pumps, just as a tip, so heads up on that. You obviously are going to need a heater as well. My heater is an Aqueon heater I really like, that's just there to make sure that the temperature of the water stays at 78 degrees constantly. Next, what you're going to need is some water. I actually recommend doing what you see me doing here and grabbing water from a tank you trust. So you see me in the background there measuring the salinity of my 120-gallon tank. What you don't see me doing is measuring exactly how much water I'm removing from the tank, because I want to know exactly how much water I'm putting into the Pico tank. It's really important to be precise in knowing how much water is in your Pico tank. This will really help you down the road when you go to test things like your alkalinity, calcium, magnesium, and in dosing. Even if you're off by just a little bit with a Pico tank, it can really cost you later. Then lastly here, I like to smooth the sand around. That's more just me and my OCD, making sure that it looks good, since this is going right in the living room.
All right, now that we've gotten to this step, we need to plug this bad boy in to get the water to stir up and make the water nice and clear. So we have already staked out where this tank is going to go. It's going to go right over here. So another thing that you're going to want to do is you're going to want one of these, obviously, to give you a few more docks to work with instead of just a single outlet in the wall. I'm actually looking at this one, and I'm already recognizing this won't do because there's only space for 2 plugs. And you need to account for at least 3 things: the light, the heater, and the pump. Anything on top of that is more than what I'm doing, but would require even more than 3 plugs. All right, so we've got this guy plugged in, so just the heater and the pump for now. We're gonna let the pump do its thing and kind of clear up the water here. Once the water's clear, the next thing I'm gonna do is make sure that the rock work is sitting just the way I like now that I've moved this 3-gallon tank over from my office to the living room. One of the tips that I give people for Picos, especially if you want a GSP background like I'm going for, you definitely wanna make sure that none of your rocks are anchored to the back wall. That's okay to do in some rock landscapes. It's very common. I know a lot of people who do that. For my 2 tanks, both here in the living room as well as the office, I've done that. But if you're going for a GSP back wall, especially in a Pico, things can get out of hand real fast if anything is touching that back wall. So bring it forward, make sure it's set, and obviously we need the water to clear up a little bit before we can even know if we're doing that. Okay, so I just got done programming the light for Pico tank here. I'm using the same Kessel A360X that I used to use on this guy before I replaced it with those Radions. So I used to use this Kessel paired up with a AI Prime 16. So the reason I replaced it was because I felt like both the bulbs in the Kessel light as well as the AI Prime were kind of losing their luster, which is why I replaced it with this guy. But I think this is just enough light, perfect in fact, for what we're building here. So I did adjust the settings a little bit so that it's not quite as high intensity, and I also made it so that this thing is going to be as blue as can be. For this tank, I'm only going to put just very, very fluorescent corals in here. There really might only be a fish or 2, and mostly invertebrates for that matter. So the blue light, I think, is really going to create a cool nightlight effect here in the living room, and that's what we're going to go ahead and run. So I've turned that on. We're still waiting for the water to clear up here, obviously. I'll probably give this thing another hour and it'll be ready to go. Okay, so it is the next day, and it took all of the next day for the tank to clear up here, which means, hello young Charlie, showing me your new Christmas toy. What that means is, realistically, this tank probably isn't getting the best flow yet. It probably means that I want to consider putting in a second pump eventually. But the good news is, I always start a Pico tank like this, and this is what I suggest anyone who's starting a Pico tank does, by placing one frag of zoanthids in the tank. So by placing a zoanthid in here, you can really test if the tank is ready, both from a water perspective as well as a... Charlie, we're making a movie here. So I always do this first because if a zoanthid isn't thriving in your Pico system on day one, then we have to evaluate, is there an issue with either the water, the setup, or the light? In this case, we look good to go, so I'm gonna put a few of my favorite first corals to start a Pico tank, and I'm gonna show you which ones those are. So coral number one is just gonna be a piece of GSP. I'm gonna grow a GSP background just like I'm doing here in the 40-gallon tank. We're gonna do the same thing here. So we're just gonna go ahead and glue this on the back of the Pico here.
Coral number two is going to be a candy cane or trumpet coral.
I also think it's important to use trumpet corals because unlike some of these other corals like GSPs or zoanthids, which are considered soft corals, candy canes actually have some calcium requirements. So if your candy canes just absolutely aren't taking off as far as growth is concerned, then that's sort of an indication without testing that lets you know that your tank just doesn't have the right alkalinity or calcium requirements. You can actually be deceived and think that your tank's doing quite lovely when in actuality your calcium and alkalinity levels are just super low if all you do is place softies like the zoanthids and the GSP up here at the top. Other corals I recommend are just your mushroom frags. So maybe not this one because this is an OG bounce mushroom. Although I think this would be sick to include in a Pico tank. It's like #goals. But there are plenty of other options. Like you've got the tequila sunrise here, which I'm probably gonna cut a frag of later today. So the other thing I'm gonna put in here today is I'm put a piece of red cap monopora up here on the top. And that's actually something I don't typically recommend. So monoporas, as you know, as you can see in the tank behind me back there, sorry, I didn't mean to zoom in on my face, but as you can see right there, things like red cap monoporas can get out of hand, assuming you're meeting your alkalinity and calcium needs. Monoporas will really take over a rock and potentially even a tank. And so a Pico tank honestly doesn't have a whole lot of space, and so I always recommend be careful with the encrusters that you put in a Pico tank. First off, it's honestly really difficult to maintain great alkalinity and calcium levels in this small of a tank. So don't plan for that, but there are some encrusters out there that just seem to grow no matter what we throw at them. And in that case, just really be careful that you don't put anything in here that's just gonna grow and overwhelm your tank. Actually, one of the corals that I see a lot of reefers get carried away with, also in larger tanks, but especially in Pico tanks, is the pulsating xenia. So once again, I just don't recommend xenia at all. I think that's a coral that can well outgrow its welcome. Don't put that in a Pico tank. It's not gonna be long before a xenia patch could take over this whole thing. The corals I do recommend for a Pico tank are exactly what we've talked about before. Zoanthids I think are great. You could totally get away with a toadstool leather in here. Now keep in mind that's also gonna be a pretty fast growing coral. GSP is a great thing to put here either in the back of a tank to give it an overall green look, as well as maybe on a small rock. Entry-level LPS corals, acans do exceptionally well, I have found, in Pico tanks, as well as the candy canes, which we've already placed in here. And then if you want to go ahead and put in a monopora or something else that's brightly colored in here, go ahead and do that. Obviously, the biggest caveat I provide to all of this is that keep in mind, it does not take many frags to fill up an entire Pico tank. So be really strategic, mindful, intentional, us yogis would say. I'm not really a yogi, that's an offense to yogis everywhere. If I consider myself a yogi, I won't do that. No, but that's a good word. Be really intentional with the corals you put in a tank this size because everything outgrows its welcome unless you really want it. So I only put really brightly colored stuff in here, and I recommend you do the same thing. Okay, but now let's talk a little bit about the fish and invertebrates that you can introduce to a tank like this. So I always start with the invertebrates for the same reason I started with this zoanthid frag. If an invertebrate can handle the tank parameters, then a fish most likely can. and invertebrates are a little cheaper. So if we're going to run that kind of science experiment to see if something can survive, we want our guinea pig to be ideally as cheap as possible, but also something cool that we might like to keep in this tank, assuming everything goes well, which I totally anticipate. So in this case, you can see that on the inside, it's a little cloudy because it's already lined with some type of algae on the glass. One of the things I really like to introduce to a Pico tank first is trochus snails. Trochus snails do a great job of mowing down any algae on the glass. You almost don't need a glass cleaner if you've got 2 or 3 trochus snails in your tank. I usually recommend a trochus snail per gallon of tank that you have, at least for Pico and nano tanks. Then the second thing you can put in here are hermit crabs. And I like to grab the electric blue hermit crabs. I just feel like there's not many things that glow blue like the electro hermit crab, so we'll be introducing those. And then after about a week, we'll assess how everything's doing and we'll decide if it's time to introduce some fish to the tank. As far as fish that you can introduce to a tank like this, what I recommend are clownfish. Obviously, you can get some Perucola clownfish, which would fit this quite nice. Once they outgrow their welcome, no fear. I mean, ideally have another tank, either a nano or like the 120 gallon in my office that they can kind of graduate into, which is nice. But gobies also do really well in a tank like this. Even the Watchman goby that, well, I don't have a Watchman goby here. There he is, do you see him? Kind of zooming in. So even that Watchman goby that I have right down there, like, he basically lives in a 3-gallon cube of space. He never leaves this corner, which is actually kind of frustrating because he's like paired off with a cool pistol shrimp back there, and we like never see that cool symbiotic relationship because he's constantly hid behind that corner and there's like mushrooms covering up that space. So that's frustrating. But a Watchman goby with a pistol shrimp in a 3-gallon Pico tank would be a great idea. There he is again. Coming out. Can you see a shrimp back there? No. Just him today, folks. Now you do need to keep in mind that a pistol shrimp in a 3-gallon cube means that any other invertebrates that you're hoping to keep as a part of that setup is likely not going to do well. Pistol shrimp are pretty aggressive and they can absolutely turn on other invertebrates. But that's it for today's video, folks. Hopefully you enjoyed this content. We will check back in a week on this tank to see how it's doing. In a week's time, I totally anticipate that this thing is going to have taken off, so I'll have a few more frags and clippings in the tank just here to start growing. I'll also have some invertebrates and hopefully a tiny little friend. Still trying to decide what I should place in here. Maybe let me know down in the comments what you think would be cool to house in a Pico tank like this. Would love to get your thoughts. Looking forward to seeing you guys in the next video. Safe reefing out there, folks.